Welcome to the Unlocking the Club podcast, where we host honest and direct conversations about journeys of access, personal truth, and reclaiming space. We share our truth so that you can find the key to own your truth, honor your journey, and reclaim your space. Grab your keys, your wallet, your phone, and invite your friends to meet you at the club. Here's your host, Angela Taylor.
Hello again, I'm Angela Taylor, your host for Unlocking the Club. And today I actually want to unlock why representation matters in media or the podcast industry. I had a really cool experience about a month ago at an in-person event where I was speaking about equity, diversity, inclusion for some visiting media personalities and executives from the travel industry. And before I got on stage to speak and to talk about equity and inclusion here in Boise, Idaho, I was interacting with the production team. And the production team actually included Anka, who is the producer for Unlocking the Club. And I shared on stage what my experience was like and why it was so important for a woman who was behind the scenes helping to produce the event, how it was different than so many of the other hundreds of events that I'd done over the course of the last decade or so. And what my experience was like for Anka was as she was setting me up with my microphone, as we were walking on stage, actually as we were even preparing for the event a few days in advance, she let me know what the setup was going to be like. When we had to place the microphone on, understood the simple motions and interactions that would make me feel comfortable as a woman. And I recognized that so often I'd had men that are putting my microphone on me, and sometimes it ends up not being in the right place because they're a little bit nervous about, of touching you or doing something that would feel inappropriate. And so how refreshing it was to have a woman in that space. I also shared how I've been at so many different events where the production team hadn't shared the setup for a panel before. And so you had some panelists who perhaps were in short skirts and they were sitting in low chairs and would feel really uncomfortable. So they may have to wear, put a napkin or something on their lap as opposed to looking cute and current, as our guest Cheryl Burrell would say, in their outfit. And so there's subtle little reasons why having diverse representation inside of various identities, whether it's race, ethnicity, whether it's educational level, whether it's ability, whether it's gender, why it's so important to have that diverse representation. And it's not just about the number or the quota, it's about the system and the structures and unlocking some of those things that oftentimes we don't think about, particularly for those that are in dominant identities, don't think about the little things that can make a big difference in someone's experience. And so the same is really true for me, as I've discovered here in building a podcast that is now award-winning or award-nominated podcast, is how important representation is, not just the talent on the microphone, but behind the scenes. And I've been really intentional as we continue to build our podcasting team and interact in the industry of trying to seek out expertise in the space from people that have a similar identity or similar lived experience as I do. And it's been a fun journey, and you're starting to see more people having that opportunity, but it's a really important perspective and voice to have. I know that the look and the feel of my branding is on point because the graphic designer and design team that I worked with was able to take my creative brief and bring it to life because they understood the things that I was looking for and asking for with some of the imagery. I know that our podcast production team, both Tree Fan Events and Crackers and Soup, both who have identities that have been historically excluded or marginalized, enhance the experience for our listeners. I know our podcast team and consulting group on my side of the lens, having a diverse group of individuals and perspectives helps me to make sure that the conversations I'm having, the guests that I'm inviting on, are representative of a broad range of perspectives and stories. And so I just want all of you to think about that in the spaces and the domains that you're navigating. Like, how can we make sure that we continue to provide access to those who have been historically excluded or marginalized in this space? Because it does matter. It matters for your experience, regardless of your identity. It matters for the listeners. It matters for the people that are participating. And it matters for the stories that we are trying to tell. And that has been one of the things that has been really a true joy for me to see and to observe and to be intentional about designing. Is I know that my voice has been and will continue to be different than it could have been, because I am taking that extra step to make sure to invite different perspectives into the conversation. And so I'm looking forward to talking a little bit more about this on today's episode of Unlocking the Club with our special guest, Melissa Haughton. Today on Unlocking the Club, I will be joined by Melissa Haughton. Melissa is a writer, marketer, and digital storyteller of Jamaican descent based in Toronto. Her work often explores ideas of family, culture, and community through the lens of Blackness. In 2020, Melissa created and produced So What Are You?, a 6-part podcast series exploring diasporic and familial relationships to cultural identity. In 2021, she co-produced Bad Internet, a 2-part audio documentary on internet disconnectivity in Canada. She is currently the marketing manager at Edit Audio, where she oversees strategy for partnerships and promotion of branded client podcasts and in-house original series, including the Ambie-nominated series Date with Daddy and Ozark's True Crime, which has surpassed 1.5 million downloads worldwide. Outside of work, you can find Melissa reading books and talking herself out of accumulating more plants. Someone that I can relate to for sure. Thanks for tuning in as we unlock the club today with Melissa Haughton. Melissa, welcome to Unlocking the Club. Thank you so much for saying yes.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Well, wonderful. I just read your bio, and one of the things I always say to guests is, right, I know that you are doing so much more than your bio contains. What else do you want our listeners to know about who you are?
Ooh, that's such a big question, but I think it's an important question. I think right now, one of the things that I'm trying to explore is kind of the juxtaposition between kind of creative production and rest. So I'm kind of, I feel like, in a cycle of where I have some ideas, I have some things, but I also want to be intentional about the capacity that I have to attribute to things. Last year, I feel like time at this point always feels a bit murky, but last year I had the honor of being part of, there's an organization called Hot Docs here in Canada. And so they had a BIPOC incubator for podcasts. So I was lucky enough to be part of that initial cohort. And as part of that, I kind of was developing an idea. And so I am hoping to continue some work on that in the new year, hopefully with some funding. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm looking forward to. I'm also trying to read, hopefully going to take up pottery as, you know, we enter into like the deeper winter season. But yeah, I think I'm just exploring kind of how creativity can kind of ebb and flow and how you can support that in the best way.
Well, I love that response, right? The juxtaposition of like being in wellness, if you will, and not over calibrating and doing too much, and still being able to be in that creative space and go where ideas lead you. Like, how do you navigate that?
I think to the best way, or the most realistic way, is honestly a lot of trial and error. I think a lot of Black women, a lot of Black folks are socialized this way, where it's kind of just like the desire to commit to many things when you think that there's an opportunity to advance, or you think, you know what, like this is an opportunity to develop. So why can't I say yes to this? Why can't I add this to the plate? I know I have this, but you know what, this could also fit. And so I kind of think of it potentially like a Thanksgiving plate. And for me, I personally, some people are like, I don't like to mix their food on the plate. I like to mix it up. So there comes a point where you have the Thanksgiving plate and maybe you got the protein, you got the mac and cheese. My family's Jamaican, so we have rice, you might have a vegetable, and you're looking at the plate and you're looking at the rest of the spread and you're like, I can probably add something else here, right? But you know what? You can, but you also can just take your first plate and then come back and get something else. But really, that's kind of the process that I have been going through, is kind of looking at my plate and saying, even if I can squish something in here, I would prefer to kind of return and do something else when I know I have the space.
Oh my gosh, Melissa, I love the analogy of the Thanksgiving plates, and maybe not because just I'm hungry at this particular moment in time, but I can totally picture that. Is like, it feels like there's a scarcity sometimes, like, right, where you have to do it all right now or you're going to miss out. And I think that that goes along with that, fear of missing out, right? That all of us, if we don't do it in this moment in time, will it be there or available later on? And what that can cause is this sense of overwhelm, because you're saying yes to too many things. And by saying yes to so many things, you're really saying no to yourself. Is that the sense of what you're trying to course correct for?
Yes, definitely. I think in that way, you have to understand that you as a resource, I mean, not to sound, particularly like full on capitalism, but you as a resource are finite, as much as I feel like people always kind of use those quotes like Beyonce has the same 24 hours in a day. Okay, factually speaking, or like literally speaking, yes. But in terms of what we all can access, there's kind of, I think, as I said before, like ebbs and flows. So sometimes there's more capacity, sometimes there's less. And so I think just understanding how to understand that you are a core element and not being dismissive of feelings that come up where even exactly theoretically you would have the capacity or it's something that you want to attain. It's about kind of really turning inward to make sure that even if the long-term goal benefits you, it's not at the expense of yourself in the present.
Now, do you sense that, with your your roots from Jamaica, being a Black woman, like, do any, your race, ethnicity, gender, does that impact that plate being too full at times?
I definitely think so. I think there's a lot of stereotypes about various cultures, but I think one of the jokes that always comes up is about Jamaicans having multiple jobs. At various points in my life, I have had multiple jobs. I think kind of in this current existence, that's something that's being more common just with side hustles or just having different things that you want to explore. But I definitely felt that culturally speaking, to have more to do, to be able to be productive in a particular way was always kind of like an important core tenet, like a core cultural value. So I think sometimes trying to understand how productivity can look different or how productivity can be rest was something that I had to really navigate over time.
Yeah, well, and productivity, because that's a thing. And who defines productivity? Right? And who determines how we define it for ourselves? Like, what is your definition of productivity? How did you come to that definition? And as you've done like these amazing films and exploring, right, culture, have you been able to unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because even when you asked that, my initial response was still to go back to the default kind of, I would say, like textbook definition of productivity means that you accomplish X, a very kind of linear definition of, you start at point A and you arrive at point B with this series of actions, hopefully increasing efficiency over time or things over time. But really, I think my personal definition of productivity, despite that kind of being my initial thing, which I suppose I should probably unpack at some point, is just working with what you have and being able to do what suits you best and what also suits the situation simultaneously. I think I saw a tweet recently that said something like, if you only have 40% on a given day, but you're giving everything in the 40% capacity that you have, like that is still quote unquote productive. Or if there's some days where I would realize, okay, I would have a task and ultimately the task needs to be done. but I would spend 2 hours working up to the task because I just knew I was in the headspace. So it's like, okay, let me sit down. Okay, let me find my way around, meander. Or if I know, hey, if you realize that you're going to probably not be in the headspace for this and there is some leeway, maybe it's better to not start at 12 and then spend 3 hours, doing things that are not going to be that helpful. But then maybe you start at 4 and you can do the same thing in 30 minutes because you understand that you've given yourself the space to like lock in or approach it in a way that is speaking to where you're at. So I think that's my definition of productivity, is just like being responsive and then doing what you can with understanding how you need to respond.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And at different stages of my journey, it felt like there's a box that you have to fit into, right? You have to work from 9 to 5. You have to show up early, leave late, like all of these different expectations, both internal and external expectations. And we never really thought about like, how are you operating at an optimal level inside of this system and the structure that has been designed? And it feels like it's not designed for everyone to thrive. It's actually designed to prevent you from being in that space where you can be super ultra productive in a shorter amount of time. And I found myself as an entrepreneur being able to have more agency over controlling my time and not having to fit into anybody else's box. But when I feel like I'm overwhelmed, I'm exhausted, my tank is empty, I can take some time. And it used to be an hour, then it was 2 hours, then it was maybe half a day, and then maybe it was a Saturday. And now I'm like, whatever time, it might be on a Wednesday afternoon, and I just need to take some time. And I know I'm going to be better off for it on Thursday as a result of it. But I don't think that, right, we tell ourselves all of those different messages and give ourselves that grace on a regular basis. So when we have this sense of balance, like, right, and that we have agency over how we want to show up, how often we want to show up, how has that changed in your journey?
I definitely think my awareness has changed a lot, because for me, it's been a lot about the shift. Even you talk a lot about structures, and I think that's so important in just changing from an equality framework to an equity framework. So it's not that everything receives the same amount of attention or the same amount of time or even the same amount of effort. It's about saying, how can I be responsive to what those needs are? If that means that something takes longer or something needs more effort at this time, and then something needs like a different type of effort, I think I move a bit more strategically, because like you said, there's a lot of these imposed rules where in some cases you're not given the space to think about, okay, 9 to 5 makes sense, but if I start at 8:30 and I'm done a bit earlier, like maybe that's more conducive to people whose thoughts are easily organized early in the day. Or you know what, maybe you need a break in the middle of the day and you can kind of do like siesta style, come back and work later. So I think it's very much been questioning those narratives of, okay, some things are non-negotiable, yes, but for the others, where do I actually fit within this, and what serves me so that I can serve the other things?
Well, speaking of, questioning, I wonder how you have navigated the podcast space in particular, doing some really important work as a Black woman.
Yeah, it has been interesting. I always say this because I think the podcast industry and the podcast community, there's a Venn diagram where they kind of overlap, but there are some distinctions. And so I think I entered the podcast community as an independent person. I didn't really know a lot about the structures. This was also a few years ago when it was kind of just like, set it up. I think a lot of that advice people still use, where it's like, plug it in, do it. And in some cases, yes, I think that's super important, just to be able to say, if there's a barrier where you're waiting until X point to be good enough for XYZ, you can do something today and iterate as you go along. So I think I started in that space. And then that luckily brought me forward to be able to kind of understand content and just an approach to creation in a way that I think wasn't hampered in the way that some of the industry elements bring in now, which I think are important as things evolve, kind of like any media entity where people are talking about monetization, sponsorship, growth. But it's definitely kind of helped me in the sense that I have a dual lens of being brought in as someone who's just like, I just want to make projects, or I used to listen to audio really when I used to commute a lot for school. So it was really just like, I'd love to try this. And now to kind of be able to see how that knowledge is evolving in the professional space has just been exciting, but not without its challenges, because structurally speaking, once again, there's still a lot of gaps in terms of where the funding goes, what the metrics tend to prioritize in terms of who gets funding, attention, support, and things like that. So I am trying to support from my space, but also knowing that there's a lot of structural things that need to happen is kind of just like the two things that you're holding in your mind and in my work kind of at any given point.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things we talk about quite a bit on Unlocking the Club is what are the stories that need to be told, right? And particularly for us, like our vision and mission is about creating a platform to share the voices and stories for Black women. And so I was quite struck when I saw the title, So What Are You? Like, right? And it feels like you are doing projects and telling stories that have been untold up until this point. What is your inspiration for that? What opportunities do you see for it? What challenges have you observed?
Yes, I think my inspiration truly is just being in existence, being in community with others, and also kind of, I think what's been underscoring this whole conversation is just the conversations you have with self, or just like the evolution of how you understand self. So for me, being in space and also just, well, not space because I sound like Elon Musk, but I just think, like,
right now.
no, we don't. But truly, it's the act of living. I think it's those things where, once again, so what are you? When I started that project, it was because the questions had arisen where it was hearing the stories that my dad would share over time and realizing that there was shorthands of things where it would just be like, and this person was here. But realizing that there was the linkages that didn't occur to say, okay, so this person was here, but where were they born? Or how did this person arrive here? Did we start off in this city in Jamaica and move? Were people, brought over from a particular part and decided to, start life in a different part of the island? Like, there's just all kinds of things where I realized there were shorthand that I kind of thought I knew and didn't. So in some ways, that's definitely a component, just revisiting things and saying, what have we not explored? And how can we take the time to do that? I think what's important in terms of kind of like how that advances is one thing that's been super important for me is like collaboration and being able to find spaces to give other people, as you said, the space to share their stories. And I think the challenges are kind of unfortunately common across industries for Black folks when it comes to accessing resources. I would say the financials. I would also say the podcast industry, this is a word you'll hear endlessly, is discoverability. And it's funny because that's often in relation to, okay, if you have a show, how our audience is discovering it. But I also think like from a collaborative standpoint, it's also how are you discovering your peers? How are you discovering, kind of to your point about the microphone and having another woman in the space? How are you finding, other folks who can support your work behind the scenes? And how are you accessing the resources that are out there that you might not know about because you truly don't know what you don't know? So I have really been grateful to work in this space because I was like, ooh, if I would have saw these resources like 5 years ago, like imagine, but also that's why I want to have a hand in sharing that knowledge out.
When you talk about discoverability, I think one of the things I know on my journey as a Black woman, I compartmentalized, right? And there were certain things about my life, my journey that I didn't want to be discoverable, right? And I wanted to be able to control whatever narrative people had access to. For you, from your perspective, how important is it that we unlock a little bit more of ourselves to allow these stories to be heard in ways that are scalable and that continue to create opportunities for others?
Yeah, I think the key is vulnerability is the key. And there's a lot of unlearning or unlocking the certain parts of your brain that tell you that these things have to be separate and never the two shall meet. I think in working, like I have a lot of gratitude for being able to work in some of the places that I worked, kind of working in government. That was kind of helpful to me in terms of understanding systems. Once again, another theme of understanding just how much people don't know about what is available to them, or like their ability to get involved in certain processes, or working for the public broadcaster. Once again, just kind of like having this space to I don't know, to really understand how the media can really be an important tool, but also why certain communities don't necessarily feel reflected, and why that can sometimes prevent stories from being told. So I think, to be honest, I am still working on that in terms of being able to kind of not have to compartmentalize or say, like, this is something that's a professional version of you, and this is something that's a vulnerable version. And so I think the best way to approach that is sometimes just to call it out, or to kind of, for me, that first instinct to question it and be like, okay, so maybe this isn't necessarily like the traditional professional thing that you would share, but what is the value, and how could that vulnerability benefit someone in a way that, you know, sticking to the preconceived ideas or the prepared notes, like how might straying away from that benefit someone else in a way that you might not have expected?
So many important points. And you said understanding systems. And a moment ago, as you were telling a story about your journey in podcasting, you're like, if I had known that back then, and then you trailed off. If you had known what, and how would you have leveraged it differently?
If I had known that sometimes the only thing that is really stopping you is not that you don't have the resources, it's the audacity. When you kind of start to see at scale, to your point, how people were just, you know, knocking on virtual doors, if you will, or asking for things to be made, or pitching stories, or having, for example, like fellowships or internships, or reaching out to organizations where, for example, maybe it doesn't start as this is a full podcast, but you have a piece that has run with a network, and that's kind of like a relationship that you can build and parlay into something else. I also think just an understanding of the careers within the industry itself, because I think back in the day, and even still, I would say a lot of people still think, okay, like host, producer, and those are the people that get things done. You're shooting for either, you know, host if you like being in front of the camera, or if you like getting things done but not necessarily being out front, you're shooting for a producer. But if I would have known that, okay, like maybe there's elements of this, and I think kind of coming back to that upbringing, and I think just how Black women can often be socialized of, I need to do everything myself. So that was very helpful for me in terms of starting shows, because I was like, all right, I'm going to edit it. I'm going to source the music. I'm going to book the interviews. I'm going to get the guests. But also it's like, there's probably, you know, jack of all trades, master of none, certain things that you like more, certain things that you're better at. And as a result, maybe if you lean into those, like there are opportunities to develop those skills, or you can get support for certain things. So I think it's just realizing how much support is out there, and then also realizing there are more roles in the world of podcasting that you think, and then also just the audacity to be like, why not my thing? My thing can also be that. It doesn't have to be at a certain level.
Yeah. I would love to, Melissa, unpack that concept of the Swiss Army knife, of being able to do everything, because there's some benefit to that, right? Is to have the skill sets that you can apply in a lot of different ways and manners, you know, now and in the future. But there also is this lack of ability or comfort in asking for help. And I wonder, I know that that has shown up prominently, unfortunately, in my life in a lot of different spaces. For you, is there a reluctance to ask for help? And why do you, if so, why do you think that is?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I think, once again, to your earlier point, there's a feeling of, okay, there's a certain image or a certain idea that you feel like you have to portray to the world. And often in professional spaces, there's a connotation, in some cases, where if you're the only Black person on the team, if there's other things where you feel like, okay, there's a space I occupy here where I need to come prepared in a way that I feel like other folks might not be expected to be, you know, whether consciously or subconsciously. You just feel like, okay, my best, or I've specifically felt that kind of like my best weapon was to be prepared all the time, and that any deviation from that would be a weakness or would prevent me from accessing the things that I needed. And so, yeah, I definitely felt as though even in podcasting, it didn't even dawn on me originally when I first started out kind of making my own small shows that yes, you can get someone to do a portion of this, even if it's not a huge budget that you have, or even if you're working with someone kind of collaboratively and they're just locked in with you and you're kind of just both putting sweat equity in equally. People can help. People want to help, I think is an important thing, because there's also that feeling of like, I don't want to inconvenience, or you know what, maybe if it was at this level, this person would be inclined. But yes, asking for help was definitely, and still to this day, continues to be something where I'm like, okay, it's okay. We don't have to know it all. We don't have to do it all. And that is okay.
Yeah. And I don't know if you're like me, but I have to find the moment to notice when that is showing up, right? Because my natural inclination is to just try to figure it out on my own, Google it, spend twice as long as I need to on something as opposed to the things that are actually going to help to build. And it shows up for a lot of different reasons. Part of it is that stereotype threat, right? Or imposter syndrome. You want somebody to think that you're not capable or you're not competent to be able to do it. Secondly, like you want to show that you are willing to do the work, right? And there's some sense of pride that you get out of being able to do a lot of things. And I have to notice for myself when what's showing up. Is it because I want to prove something to myself or to others? And is that the best way to prove it? Or does the outcome matter more than the process? And is this just a thing that I have where I just want to learn something? Like learn something new, a new skill set. And so it's kind of a dangerous place to be in. But for me, it's been helpful starting to understand that shows up for me quite often, that lack of willingness to ask for help. And one of my business partners, Stacy, has said years ago, like, I just want to hit the easy button. And then we had to unpack what that actually meant, right? It doesn't mean that you're not going to do easy, right? Makes it sound like what everyone thinks as a Black person, like, right, that you're lazy, don't work hard, all those things. And I had to reconcile my relationship with ease to understand that, like, right, I can still be really good at what I do. I can still be intelligent, ambitious, but I don't have to do all of the things to prove that to others. And has that shown up for you?
Yes, I think the concept of ease and easy definitely have shown up. And yes, just being able to take that step back. I think for me, it has looked like I'm still not necessarily saying, okay, I can end this, but I can lessen potentially the steps that it takes before I realize, okay, I have the spreadsheet open, I have 6 Google tabs, and then you look up and you're like, you know what? Okay. I think kind of trying to look at what is coming up has been important, but also that's always the thing. There's always the inclination that I have that I will override, where that thing comes up and it's like, I'm not sure about this. And it probably would be faster, but then it's just those learned behaviors of, but I should still try to do it anyway. And so I think it's kind of just trying to like honor those initial thoughts, because that's also some form of information to be like, you know what, maybe this time is just not the time for you to spend 6 hours doing this. You can call someone to look it up for you. That's okay. And easy doesn't mean, right, you might not have tried something to make it work. It just means we recognize when someone else might be able to, shoulder some element of the load.
Exactly. You can be selective. I found that there are moments where I would hesitate making an ask, and then I ask for something. Someone shares it with me, doesn't think twice about it. I don't think twice about it. Now I have this information that I can now leverage. And you're like, wait a minute, like it took me 2 days to even make that ask, right? But it reminds me of your initial kind of metaphor around the plate, right? Like, are we filling our plates in a way where we can be productive, in a way that we can be in wellness? And since that you are on that journey and you're creating those opportunities due to the work and the stories that you're sharing. And I wonder, you've talked a little bit about this, is how do we encourage more diversity in the podcast space, particularly the marketing space and the industry outside of just being in front of the mic? Because I think that will help us. Like if I'm asking you for help, it feels differently than if I'm asking someone who I presume is going to think that I'm not capable.
Exactly. Yes. And I think that first layer is so important in removing the barriers to getting people into the industry. But there was a report, I think it was an Edison research report that looked at the Black listeners. And of course, it was mostly a listener focused survey. But within that, there was a lot of data that showed that Black listeners are interested in hearing a breadth of content, but there's not always that content available. And so to me, once again, kind of it went back to, so what is the gap here? And I think that's when you look at, okay, not only is it about the hosts who are critical, there's an infrastructure or a structural gap in terms of getting all of the people required. I think from a knowledge perspective, telling people what is required in terms of what you need from a resource perspective for podcasts to be done, in terms of human resources, all kinds of things. There's kind of that gap. And then two, the fact that when it comes to certain levels, after maybe the host and the producer, when you start looking at who's available for things, that's when you start seeing dwindling numbers of Black folks. To be quite fair, I feel like even when I've attended events or even across LinkedIn, anytime when I see someone who is Black and in podcast marketing, my first thing is like, really? And that's always a little bit scary because it shouldn't be shocking. But secondly, it still feels like you're kind of, seeing a distant friend across like a big party and being like, hey, what are you doing here? And that feeling to me is bittersweet because it's exciting that things are changing. But by and large, when I still kind of show up at in-person events or you look at the slate of folks who are talking, I think we're starting to see shifts in terms of some elements of power. But if we're looking kind of like VPs of, people who are making large content decisions, people who are working in certain like engineering roles or like critical production roles, it's still quite slow in terms of seeing that kind of diversity reflect throughout all elements of like what makes a podcast possible. And yeah, that's definitely something that I am hopeful for, but I know that it's still kind of a work in progress.
Yeah. So as we are navigating this work in progress, who do you have to be to show up in those spaces where you may on occasion see someone who you can connect with? But most often the room is full of people that don't look like you, have a similar experience or lived experience as you do.
I'm going to be honest. Sometimes you do still have to do that preparatory deep breath where, maybe you enter a room and you're not surprised, but you still understand from a positioning standpoint. And I don't always even think it's with any malice, but that there's kind of some, not mythology, but there's a reason that you take that deep breath because you understand, okay, when I'm here, people are going to want to know who I represent. They're going to want to know what I have to offer. And they're probably going to want to know what are my credentials or what qualifies me to be here, which I think are standard things that people want to know in general spaces. But there's just an added layer when you look around and you're like, okay, I have to kind of forge ahead. So in those spaces, it definitely is a deep breath. But then I also think it's about just returning to yourself and really focusing on what you are there to get out of it and kind of blocking out, because all of the messages, all of the things can come up where you're like, okay, these are the things that I feel and those things are valid. But ultimately, I think I try to approach with like a sense of curiosity where I'm like, if I can just engage with people on a one-to-one basis and just really stop looking at it as like a seed that I have to forge through, that tends to help me. B, just remembering that you are not actually there to prove anything. You are simply here to exist in the way that everyone else is here to exist. So that's not always to say that those thoughts don't come through. It's just more so just kind of saying, okay, we have to shake off some of this to be able to continue. And then I think that's it. It's just kind of being present as much as possible and going from there, because you remember that you are there because you have knowledge to share and knowledge to gain. So it's kind of just moving forward with that.
Yeah. Have you ever felt like you did show up and felt like you had to prove? And in that instance, how did you show up?
I definitely have felt that. I think I can talk about a situation where I initially kind of felt taken aback. And so there was kind of an event with a lot of senior leaders, and I was still kind of newish into the space. And I just knew kind of there has been a guest list shared beforehand where I was looking forward to the event, but on the day of kind of being in the space and realizing that I hadn't met a ton of people in person, and also just like from a positionality standpoint, a lot of these people were kind of to the whole structural thing. And once again, people were at large major brands who were likely looking to invest in companies or projects that kind of were doing large returns. And where I work at Audio, some of that is, we do work with some clients who have large shows, but there's also a focus on really supporting marginalized creators. And in that way, the metrics are different. It's not always about, okay, is it the most downloads that you need? Or is it about people who are being retained episode to episode? Is it about reflecting experiences of communities that are not always widely shared? Like those are equally as important metrics. So on the day of that event, I really shrunk. I did. I went into that space and I just felt like I couldn't break through because I was looking at it as kind of like this impenetrable wall, as opposed to saying, okay, this is an instance for me to take a step. And one step can kind of, leapfrog you to another step and another step. So I think in that instance, I kind of reverted because I just didn't know what I was supposed to do. But there was another event that was a conference, and we had kind of like a physical footprint there, and we had a physical booth. And so part of that was an activation that I had designed to kind of engage people to come in and speak. And so I think in the first sense, having something that drew people in encouraged me, because it's like, just a reminder, you don't always have to do the heavy lifting yourself. We can bring people in with an experience that's kind of like the marketing perspective. We can bring something of value. At one event, we had a local artist doing embroidery. So that kind of drew people in that sense. And yeah, I think I just approached that by engaging people one-to-one. And that reminded me that, once again, you have the space to be here, and it's just one step at a time.
You have the space to be here. I appreciate you sharing that story, because I think it shows up quite often for many of us, right? Proving is a real thing. And as you were sharing your story, it reminds me of so many episodes in my life, right, where that came up and it was counterproductive. I think oftentimes when I found myself having to prove my worthiness, my value, I've overcalibrated. And similar to the analogy as if you're in, and I can't swim, so this is a bad analogy, but if I was in a pool of water, I would probably be over calibrating, right? And what so many people say is you have to relax, right? Relax. And what you just shared, I think, is really important in those spaces. If you pause and notice that you feel like you have to prove your worthiness, first is to find somebody, surround yourself with people who can tell you your value, tell you what you bring to the table. And then in that moment, know that you're in the room for a reason, and that what you have, the lived experience you have, the expertise that you have, no one else has, and that you bring value to the table. And there's always more learning and growing that we can do. But I think that sense of proving has been so counterproductive to me. And I know it showed up so often throughout the course of my journey. And sometimes I couldn't get out of my own way, but you know how somebody else sees you. You know that they don't see your capability. And so you want to, in an instant, be able to prove them wrong and to prove yourself right. And so I appreciate the story that you just shared about showing up. How with your family, who is it that creates the space to allow you to know who you are and what your value is?
I would definitely say my dad is kind of like a very grounding figure in that way, because I have always been grateful in the sense that he never really put traditional pressure, I would say, on us to, have to achieve in a certain way. I would say, there's things around like grades and things growing up that were important, but I would say kind of as our relationship evolved into adulthood, there's just always that sense of, he would always just say, and always still says, I'm proud of you. And it's not always tied to the things that you do. You just know that you always have someone who's in your corner, regardless of kind of what your productivity is or your output is. And so, yeah, I think just having the space where it's someone who knows you fundamentally and what you can offer. And maybe sometimes that offering is just being present. That's always something that I return to.
Yeah, so important. And I think so often we discount those messages of people that know us and know us really well and care for us, and that can just give us that sense of pride. And it doesn't have to be this magnified, right, statement. And it's tough to navigate that because so often we think about others' opinions. And so you were telling the story earlier about needing to exhale or pause before walking into the room. And it reminded me of a colleague of mine who was an executive at this company and said that anytime that he would have a big presentation, so oftentimes he would be the only Black male in the room. And so when he would have a big presentation, he would find himself on his way to work listening to some Tupac, like, right? And throwing some Tupac on. And when he would pull into his parking space, like he would just sit in the car, just listen to Tupac to get him fired up and ready to walk into that room. And that's what has to happen so often when we are the only one, is we have to get ourselves prepared for that. And so for those listeners who are allies or accomplices, like, right, there's so many subtle little things that you could do to close that gap. And one of them is what Melissa just pointed to, was just to be in conversation with us one-on-one. And we get one ally or one colleague, and then we get more along the way. I think is so important. And so, Melissa, I want to come back on the back nine here with you in a second and to dig in more into who you are and what you've been learning about yourself along the way on this journey. But I really appreciate so many of the spaces and the honesty and candor that you've shared thus far about the challenges, the opportunities, the exciting things that you are discovering about yourself and the podcast industry. But this is Angela Taylor, host of Unlocking the Club. We will be right back with the back nine and Melissa Haughton. Welcome back to Unlocking the Club. We're here on the back nine with our special guest today, Melissa Haughton, who is doing some amazing things in the podcast space. And Melissa, we've kind of talked about this sense of having to prove yourself, or, you know, your father being that source of power and inspiration for you. When you think about things beside your own home, what is the place that you feel safest to be yourself?
That is a great question. I would say it's very cliched, but being out in nature, I am a big fan of cycling. I bike a lot in the city. It is the best way to get around when the temperature is cooperating. And so anytime I feel like I just need to be grounded, heading to the water, heading to the lake, just being out in a space where your brain can have some time to get itself together, I definitely would say out in nature.
I love that. Exactly. Like all of my best ideas come, whether I'm on a drive somewhere or a hike with friends. I think there's so much to that. I love that. What's a situation that you walk into with trepidation every time?
Ooh, every time. I feel like I've been on a lot of flights. And so every time I get into the airport, I'm always thinking, okay, do I have this? Do I have that? Do I have that? No matter what, I don't think I ever arrive into the airport feeling like, okay, I've done it all. I'm always thinking I must have forgot something. Do I have my headscarf? Is my passport here, even though I've checked for it 55 times? That's definitely something where I'm always a little like, okay, I know it, but let's just make sure.
Oh my goodness. I can relate to that. And I don't know if you're having the same experience, but I traveled frequently before COVID. And then there was a 2-year hiatus. And it feels like I haven't gotten back into that rhythm of knowing, okay, this is the bag I carry all the time. It has my passport. It has all the things that I need. Like, I still feel like I go to the airport and I forget so many of the subtle little things that were just effortless before.
Right. And then, when you have to purchase it from whatever convenience store or thing that's there, you are just like, and that is sitting on the counter at home, and I hate it. But yes, definitely a readjustment period.
Yeah, that same thing happened to me on a recent trip. Is I have a blanket. Like, I get cold in movie theaters, on flights. And so like I have to carry like my little travel blanket. And so on the way out there, I had it in my carry-on bag. And on the way back, I had a busy day. And so I didn't want to carry it to the meeting that I was going to. So I put it into my checked luggage. And in the back of my mind, I was like, I just need to pull it out before I check that bag. Well, I totally forgot it, pulled my blanket out before I checked the luggage, and my flight was delayed and it was freezing in the airport. And it was about 10 minutes before a lot of the shops were closing. And I'm sitting there like, okay, do I wait and get on this plane knowing that most likely it's not going to be the temperature that is ideal for me to feel comfortable? Or do I go buy another blanket? So I had to go buy another blanket before the shop closed. And I'm like, this would never have happened to me 2 years ago because I know my processes. So yeah, I love that you brought up travel and getting on that flight. What's something, Melissa, about you as you've learned more and more about who you are, something that you refuse to hide?
Ooh, that is a great question. Something that I refuse to hide, I would say I really like to plan. And so I feel like that is something where you obviously have to be responsive because everybody has their various approaches to how things get done. But I think as time has gone on, I have been more honest about my needs to know what is going on. So I feel like I used to be like, you know what, it's okay, we'll just wait. But now I'm like, okay, y'all, just checking in. What time are we doing this? But I would also say that comes in combination with also not knowing that I don't have to do everything. So sometimes it's just an ask and realizing that, okay, I can ask because I like the knowledge, but if someone says they're going to do X, I'm going to have to let them do X, and whatever happens with it, even if I couldn't do it in these couple minutes, I'm just going to wait,
Yeah.
and let them do the thing. Someone's like, I'm going to make the reservation. I'm like, I could open this now. It's nice to have the plan, but let me just wait because you said you're going to do it and I support you. So the knowledge, but also the rest a little bit, the ease, I think.
The ease. I love that, right? That's that Pareto rule, right? 80-20. So 20% of the people doing 80% of the work. And so often, right, if you are the planner, everyone is like, okay, well, Melissa just asked, so she can just go ahead and make that phone call. But I love the fact that you recognize that I still need to have the plan, but I don't have to be the one making the plan and completing the plan. That's
Yes.
awesome. Well, so as you're navigating this, what's your superpower?
Ooh, I would say my superpower is the ability to look at disparate things and find a through line to bring them together. I really am always in pursuit of knowledge. I love books, and I'm just someone who I just always love understanding processes or context and history. And so I love to cook. And I think that's kind of like the best way where that is applied, where I can kind of see, okay, maybe we have some mint here, and then we have, this protein here. And then I think, okay, so what cultures would these kind of things be brought together in? And then you can kind of start to build something through different things. And I think storytelling, podcasting is about that as well. You start with a question, you start with a story, you start with an identity, and you have to kind of think, how do we make this something that maybe doesn't resonate with a wide audience, but resonates with a specific audience? Or how do we bring in a very specific experience and universalize it in a way where maybe you didn't grow up in XYZ town, but you can understand why this is a story that needs to be told. So I think that's kind of very important, just because I love to eat, but also in terms of being in workspaces and in a storytelling kind of industry.
Yes, you can tell you have an ability to pull these two opposing thoughts together. And that is something that is of interest to you. A lot of the stories that you shared today was like, how do I counteract this thing with that thing? And how do I reconcile it in between? So I can see the through line being a space that you love to play in as you're creating that 5-star dish. I love that. When you think about the world that we live in currently, and in particular the spaces that you navigate, what is a story that you believe still needs to be told?
Ooh, that is difficult because I think there are so many stories that need to be told. But I also think there are a lot of stories that need to be revisited. I would say kind of like selfishly, and I think there have been some conversations about this online, but if we look at a lot of folks who identify as first or second generation immigrants, I think there is a particular understanding of, okay, being a third culture kid, or, how are we managing these tensions? And I think a lot of those stories were really important to tell. I think So What Are You was part of doing that, because I was just kind of grappling and threw it into an audio medium because I was just like, I want to have a space to do this. And I was really grateful to have audio as a space to do that. But I also think there's a dominant perspective, which is kind of like people like me who are like, our parents were like this, our grandparents were like this. But I think there is space to kind of start questioning even the perspectives that are held in those ways. I still think there is more to dive into in terms of, just understanding linkages around, maybe we were on one end of a certain type of discipline, and we understand that we might not be keen on that anymore, but we also just want to hear the other perspectives, maybe from our elders, maybe in different ways. But I just think there are stories that can always be revisited, and there's just so much on earth. And I think selfishly, kind of coming back to podcasting, like I just want to hear Black people doing any kind of, experimental, strange, like any topic under the sun. I just feel like there's always more space to hear that. I want to hear about nerd things. I want to hear about, someone's just like in nature doing this. Like, I just want to hear it all, truthfully.
Yeah, it feels like who the hero is can change, right? As we share these stories, we can share them through a different prism and a different lens. And the narrator can shift, and that can have a profound change on the outcome of the story or the experience that listeners or readers or viewers have, for sure. No, I love that. When you think about, again, even with the stories that you want to tell, you can tell that you want to bring this through line, like bring things together, these two disparate thoughts. But when you think about being at your best and being that person that's able to connect this complex content, if you will, and however you define what best is, right? What is true for you when you're at your best?
I think when I'm at my best, I am focused, but I also have room to make mistakes. So that means that, exploring things without judgment or without saying that, okay, this might result in something that's usable. Maybe you're just making a project for project's sake. I would say collaborative. So you have people I have the group chat. Sometimes it can be as small as, is this an outfit that looks good? Or, what do you think about this? So I think having people to reflect things back to, or, get feedback around, I think being in collaboration and also being able to support others, that's something that's big for me. And also well-fed and well-rested, some good sleep and a good meal, truthfully.
Amen. And not necessarily in that order, right? Well, fed and well rested could be at the top of that list for many of us, for sure. Well, you obviously are doing a lot of amazing things in the podcast space. What would be required for us to continue to unlock the club in the podcast space?
I think what would be required is vulnerability. I think being honest about the challenges, but also in showing that there are opportunities on the other side, because it's kind of like, hey, if we're real about this element being here, for example, the fact that you might go into production and maybe the host is Black, but the engineer, the tech, the AP, and the other folks might not be, if we're honest about those feelings, that can be an opportunity, for example, someone to see, oh, I didn't know those other roles were available on the show. I think being transparent is super key for that. I would also say, honestly, just being open and having like a spirit, basically the opposite of the scarcity mindset. So anytime someone is looking for someone, I feel like that's how so much gets done anyways. It's like, do I know someone I can tap in? Even if there's someone who I might not know directly, like if this seems like something they might have put something out about, can I get in touch with them to say, hey, this might be relevant to you? If I come across grants, can I amplify those like in our newsletter? Can I tell my friends to apply to these things? I think it's just knowledge sharing, being vulnerable, and also just kind of trying to advance to truthfully, because the more skills and things you acquire, the more that you can teach other people, the more that you could connect with a wider network, and then kind of grow in all the abilities to be able to like be more vulnerable and to also like tap in others.
Yes. And what's so important about your messages in this conversation, Melissa, is that this is relevant in any industry that you're navigating. And I appreciate you sharing that perspective of what's required to unlock the podcast industry, because I think it happens in corporate America, it happens in media, it happens in sports and entertainment, it can happen in nonprofits, it can happen in philanthropy. Like all of those different things are really incredibly important. So thanks for sharing that perspective. And where can our listeners find you, and what projects are you currently working on?
Yeah, so you can find me across socials at Melissa Haughton. That's MELISSAHAUTE. I'm currently developing another story that coincidentally really touches on kind of failure and perfection and self-examination. So that's an audio project that I am working on that I will hopefully have more information about soon. And you can see some of my other work at my website, which is melissahaughton.com.
Awesome. So the fear conversation, right? That's another full episode right there, because that shows up quite a bit and prevents us from being able to lean in fully and to be in wellness. So I look forward to being able to follow that project as you get ready to launch that for sure. And I am so grateful for you for taking the time, for saying yes to being on Unlocking the Club, and for sharing your perspective and your wisdom and your journey with our listeners.
Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Melissa. Yet again, another amazing conversation. Melissa Haughton is doing some amazing work in the podcast industry and offered some really interesting perspective about her journey. But I think it's relevant for so many of us, regardless of the spaces that we are currently navigating. And I, in particular, really enjoyed her analogy about that plate of food, that I know for sure on holidays that I'm trying to make sure I grab a spoonful of everything and put it on the plate, versus just taking my time and having the growth mindset and knowing that I'll be able to have some of that cake and that mac and cheese and those greens, and I don't have to get it all at once, but I can leave room and space on my journey for it all in due time. And so hope you enjoyed our conversation today with Melissa Haughton. Make sure you check out our show notes to find out more about the wonderful work that she's doing, the upcoming projects that she has. Subscribe to her newsletter when you go on her website. And if you want to continue this conversation, please head on over to the Code Breakers Lounge on Facebook, where we'll continue to dive into this discussion, what we heard, what we learned, what we appreciated, and what really resonated with us. I so appreciate each and every one of you for continuing to listen to Unlocking the Club. These conversations are so cathartic for me. Our guests are incredible people and humans that are doing great work. And I hope that all of these conversations resonate with you. Continue to listen to us. If you are enjoying a particular episode or a concept, please leave us a review. The reviews help us in a lot of different ways so that we can make sure that we continue that conversation or invite specific guests. And it helps other potential listeners find our podcast because you let them know what resonated with you. So thank you all again for listening to Unlocking the Club. We appreciate your support, and we look forward to being in conversation for our next episode. And until then, be well.
Thanks for listening to Unlocking the Club. If this conversation resonated with you, subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or your favorite streaming platform so that you can experience every episode. And follow us on social media, where you'll hear about future guests, access special features, and connect with this amazing community. Head on over there and let us know how you are unlocking the club. Until next time, peace.